There's a street in York where the sun never touches the ground. The buildings lean toward each other overhead, almost kissing, as if the whole city had been holding its breath for 700 years. And it's no accident. Every inch of that shadow was designed, calculated, almost stolen. The product of a quiet war between greed, taxes, and the urgent need to hide something from daylight. Because under that shadow lived the most dangerous and most necessary man in any medieval city. The butcher. A man who could feed an entire street, or slowly kill it with a single piece of bad meat sold at the wrong moment under the wrong light. And the law knew it, which is why it watched him the way we watch hazardous material handling today. With the pillory, with fire, with the loss of an ear. In 1348, a man named John Gleeson found a dead sow rotting in a ditch outside London. What he did with that animal, and who he sold it to, would become one of the strangest, most revealing trials in the city's records. A case that ends with rotten meat burning under the nose of a man tied down, unable to escape his own crime. And once a year, those same blood-soaked men traded their aprons for costumes and climbed onto an ox-drawn wooden stage to act out, in front of the entire city, one of the most sacred moments in Christian faith. Except the story almost everyone tells about that scene is wrong, and the true version is even more unsettling than the legend. Over the next few thousand words, we'll walk through sunless streets, courtrooms with no mercy, laws so badly written they'd confuse a modern lawyer, and a stage where real blood and stage blood blurred together in front of an entire city. And at the end, we'll recreate the dish that fed this world. Bring your appetite, or don't. If you've made it this far, that sunless street and that 1348 trial have already hooked you. Before we go any deeper into this world, give me 2 minutes. Subscribe to the channel. It's genuinely what decides whether videos like this keep getting made, and it costs you nothing. Drop a like too. It takes less time than it took a medieval butcher to sharpen a single knife. And since we're all here because we love this kind of history, tell me in the comments what city and country you're watching from. I actually read them, and I love watching that map form in the comment section. People from completely different corners of the world connected by the same question. What was it actually like to live and work in a world with no refrigeration, no antibiotics, and zero margin for error? Today we're recreating a dish from 1430, recorded in one of the most important culinary manuscripts of medieval England. A stewed beef and onion dish covered in a wine, vinegar, and saffron sauce. But before anything goes into the pot, we need to understand the man who put that meat on the table in the first place, and exactly what kind of surveillance he was operating under. Because the medieval butcher wasn't the filthy, dishonest villain popular imagination likes to draw. He was a professional surrounded by laws strict enough to make a modern health inspector nod in approval. We're going to walk through punishments that would look like torture today. An architectural loophole born out of pure tax evasion, a law so badly written it seems designed to confuse, and a historical misunderstanding about a stage in York that almost nobody tells correctly. Get the pot ready, get your appetite ready, and most importantly, get ready to never look at a cut of meat the same way again. Long before any law against rotten meat, long before the pillory or the stage in York, the butcher was already one of the most organized trades in all of medieval London. The earliest records of regular gatherings among London butchers date back to around the year 975, when these men were already meeting periodically in halls scattered across the city, hashing out rules, prices, and internal disputes, long before the word guild became official shorthand for a trade organization. But meeting informally is one thing. Having formal recognition with the power to police your own members and punish anyone who broke the rules, is something else entirely. That came later, with the first formally registered butchers' guilds in England around 1272. A milestone that turned a loud band of tradesmen into a corporation with real legal weight in the eyes of the city. And becoming a fully certified butcher, with the guild's seal of approval, was neither fast nor simple. The training system of the time followed an almost philosophical logic. It was understood that a man only reached true mastery of a craft like this at 24 years old. A boy could start as an apprentice while still a child, but he only became a recognized master after more than a decade with his hands literally in blood, learning every cut, every mistake, every unwritten rule of the trade. That long stretch of training made sense given the stakes of the job. One wrong cut could ruin the entire carcass. One wrong judgment about freshness could sicken an entire family. There was no room for amateurs in a trade where a mistake carried consequences that went far beyond financial loss. Over time, these men left such a strong mark on the urban landscape that entire streets came to carry the name of the trade. Butcher's Row, Butcher's Lane, and the most evocative of all, Flesh Shambles, a word that comes from the Old English for bench or stall, the wooden counter where meat was laid out for sale. Every major city had its own shambles, but none became as famous as the one in York. So well preserved, it's still a must-see tourist stop today. As late as 1885, there were still 31 butcher shops operating side by side on that same narrow medieval street. Today, ironically, those same storefronts sell artisanal candles and Harry Potter trinkets to tourists. The blood and grease replaced by scented soap. But why was that street, and so many other shambles across England, built so narrow that sunlight barely reaches the ground? There's a fascinating theory, without complete official documentation, but perfectly consistent with the logic of the time. Less direct sunlight meant a cooler environment, and a cooler environment meant meat lasting longer before spoiling. In an age with no refrigeration, every degree less was a small, silent victory against decay. And there's a second reason, this one well documented, that pushed these streets deeper into shadow. Property tax in many English towns was calculated based only on the footprint a building occupied at street level, the ground floor. That created an incentive both perverse and genius for any property owner sharp enough to exploit it. All you had to do was build the upper floors jutting out over the street itself, and suddenly there was more usable space on the second and third floors without costing an extra penny in taxes. Multiply that calculation across an entire street of butchers competing for space, and you understand why the buildings practically embrace each other over the heads of anyone walking below. The result is a kind of accidental architectural trap. Shadowed streets born out of pure tax dodging, which happen to serve perfectly the purpose of keeping meat fresh. Practicality and greed shaking hands without meaning to, but shade and freshness only solved half the problem. The other half depended entirely on laws sharp enough to take an ear off anyone who tried to cheat. In 1266, an English statute laid out, with almost administrative coldness, the fate awaiting any butcher caught selling contaminated meat, meat from a diseased animal, or meat so old it had lost all of its natural quality. The prescribed punishment was the pillory, head and hands locked in wood, while the entire city paraded past to watch, point, and, if they felt like it, throw whatever was at hand. There was no quiet fine paid discreetly, no backroom settlement out of the neighbor's sight. Punishment was, above all, a public spectacle designed to work as a permanent warning to any other trader on the same street thinking about cutting corners. The system was built to scale, almost like a ruler for repeat offenses. The first time, punishment was relatively mild. A fine, or, for those who couldn't pay, 20 days in prison living on nothing but bread and water. Unpleasant, but survivable. The second time, the fine doubled, or the guilty party went straight to the pillory. The third time, everything doubled again, and the physical punishment grew even harsher. The loss of an ear. And the punishment didn't stop at the body. The condemned carried, for the rest of his life, the label of infamous man, someone whose word no longer held any weight in any future trial. In some towns, the ultimate punishment wasn't physical at all. It was social. Banishment. That might sound gentler than losing an ear, but in practice it was close to a slow death sentence. Living outside the protection of any organized community meant becoming an outlaw in the most literal sense of the word, exposed to every kind of danger with no safety net whatsoever. And there's one recorded case that illustrates all of this with almost cinematic detail. In London's records from 1348, two names appear: John Gleeson of Renham and Agnes la Ismonger, daughter of a hardware merchant, both accused of selling putrid, foul-smelling meat at several points across the city, endangering the lives of buyers and staining the reputation of the entire city government. Agnes's defense was direct. Yes, she sold that meat, but she bought it from John believing, in good faith, that it was quality product. And this is where the case turns into something like a modern courtroom drama, because John ends up confessing. He admits to selling Agnes the meat of an already dead sow found rotting in a ditch on the outskirts of London. He himself skinned the animal and prepared the meat, both cooked and raw, to resell not only to Agnes, but to any other buyer willing to make a deal. The court had to hand down two very different verdicts based on the exact same evidence, which alone says a lot about how these trials weighed intent, not just outcome. Agnes was acquitted, recognized as the victim of a scheme orchestrated by someone else. John, on the other hand, was found guilty and sentenced to the pillory at Cornhill, one of London's busiest intersections, guaranteeing the largest possible audience for his public humiliation. The sentence went beyond simply locking him in place. The very rotten meat he had tried to sell was burned right under his nose while he stood trapped, unable to escape the smell he had once tried to hide from his customers. An almost poetic cruelty, turning the seller's crime into his own sensory punishment, tailor-made to fit exactly what he'd done. These cases weren't rare exceptions used to scare the public straight. They were part of a functioning legal system that existed because eating spoiled meat, with no modern medicine available to treat serious food poisoning, could mean the difference between a passing stomachache and a death sentence. Protecting the consumer, long before that term existed, was a matter of collective survival. And the logic behind these medieval laws isn't all that different from the logic behind any modern health inspection agency. There's a phrase I honestly think deserves to make a comeback today, and it comes straight from a very specific medieval law: selling meat by candlelight. It's not a poetic figure of speech. It's a direct reference to a crime that genuinely existed, documented, with a date and a reign attached to it in the English records. The kind of small detail that reveals far more about how an entire society thought than any generic summary of medieval laws ever could. Around 1320, during the reign of Edward II, a group of butchers had their entire stock of beef and pork confiscated for one very specific reason: displaying that meat for sale by candlelight. The crime wasn't the quality of the meat itself. It was the timing and the lighting chosen to sell it. In practice, This meant it was illegal to sell meat after the church bell marked the 9th hour of the day, which, depending on the season, could come around fairly early in the afternoon. After that point, natural daylight began to fade, and it was exactly that strong, revealing daylight that authorities wanted present in every meat transaction. In some towns, the rule was even stricter. You weren't even allowed to cut meat by candlelight, let alone sell it. The logic behind this is basically a consumer psychology manual applied to the 14th century. Under direct sunlight, even meat that wasn't technically rotten yet, but was starting to turn, would show visible signs, a grayish tint, a slightly slimy texture. Small details the eye catches almost instinctively. Under the flickering yellowish glow of a candle, though, those same signs practically vanished. A cut of meat right at the edge of going bad could, under that dim light, look perfectly fine. The buyer would walk home with something that smelled reasonably okay, but whose true appearance, in daylight, would tell a completely different story. And this is worth repeating, because it comes up every single time medieval food gets discussed. The idea that spices were used to mask the taste of rotten meat is, with all due respect, a myth that needs to die already. First, because selling bad meat was already illegal and extremely risky, as we just saw. Second, because no amount of cinnamon on earth disguises the smell of decomposition. And third, the most definitive argument of all, spices like cinnamon, cloves, and saffron were extremely expensive, locked away in chests inside the wealthiest households. Anyone with enough money to heavily season a dish had more than enough money to buy top-quality meat. The two things simply don't coexist in the same economic logic, no matter how much the internet insists otherwise. Interestingly, that same vagueness that sometimes showed up in the laws also showed up in the recipes of the time. Instructions like, cook until the meat is done, but not overdone, sound frustratingly imprecise to anyone used to modern recipes packed with exact minutes and oven temperatures. But thinking about it more, that might actually be the most honest instruction anyone could have given back then. Game meat, so common on medieval tables, varies enormously in toughness depending on the animal, its age, the cut used. With no standardized ovens, no identical pots, no thermometers, saying cook until it's done was, in practice, far more reliable than any fixed number of minutes could ever be. Between the daylight that exposed bad meat and the candlelight that hid it, between vague recipes that were actually practical wisdom disguised as imprecision, it becomes clear that the medieval butcher's world ran on its own quiet, sensory logic, one that only makes sense once you understand the tools and the limits of the time he lived in. It wasn't ignorance. It was constant adaptation to an environment that never offered two identical variables. If the meat that got sold was watched this closely, what was left over was an equally serious problem: guts, blood, the bits nobody wanted to buy. For a long time, the most practical solution butchers had was simply tossing all of it into the nearest stream or river. And in London, that meant straight into the Thames. The problem grew big enough that, under the reign of Richard II, orders went out banning the slaughter of animals within city limits altogether, an attempt to push the mess and the smell out of public view. Decades later, under Edward IV, a new order had to be issued to London's mayor and sheriffs, repeating essentially the same demand: stop dumping entrails in the river. The fact that the same law needed to be rewritten generation after generation says a lot about how hard this habit was to actually control. Records from the period describe the smell of butchers dumping entrails straight onto the pavement as a nuisance, worthy of formal complaint before the court. And there's a darker detail lurking in all of this. people with leprosy were often segregated from cities because of the smell the disease was believed to give off. That same sensory reasoning that isolated the sick also quietly shaped how the city tried to deal with the constant stench of the butcher shops. Specific laws began stating that entrails and buckets of blood could only be removed at night, never during the day, and that no blood could be left exposed and unwashed for more than a single day. In some towns, it was strictly forbidden to throw entrails off bridges crossing major rivers, a rule so oddly specific it only exists because, clearly, someone was doing exactly that, often enough to require a written ban. On top of all that came another kind of restriction, this one not from a city hall but from the church. The liturgical calendar dictated, with the full force of law, dozens of days throughout the year when meat simply couldn't be eaten, and consequently couldn't be sold or slaughtered. The list included the 40 days of Lent, every Friday of the year, and depending on the region and whichever pope happened to be in charge, Wednesdays and Saturdays too. Doing the math, a medieval butcher could spend a massive chunk of the calendar simply banned from practicing his own trade. And the most curious part is who got put in charge of enforcing it. Fishmongers, direct competitors on every other day of the year, but official inspectors on the meatless ones. That exact setup opened the door to one of the funniest bits of creativity in medieval cooking, stretching the definition of fish as far as it could possibly go. Beavers made the cut in certain places, and so did waterfowl. There's even a record of a monk who seriously argued that veal should count as fish because the calf had recently been inside the womb, a liquid environment and therefore aquatic by nature. On the days they were finally allowed to work, butchers had to make the most of every opportunity, using practically every part of the animal. From the best cuts down to the offal sold separately in dedicated tripe shops, nothing went to waste, because the time available to sell was, quite literally, limited by religious decree. And when they finally could sell, they still faced yet another layer of control, pricing laws set by the guild itself. There's a passage of period law so confusing, so packed with clause inside clause inside clause, that I read it over and over trying to figure out exactly what it was saying, and I'm still not entirely sure I caught every nuance correctly, translating the general spirit of that nearly unreadable text. No butcher could charge more than his neighbors charged for similar goods, unless he had to transport the meat over a considerably longer distance, which justified a small markup, never an exaggerated one. In practice, the rule existed to stop any single seller from getting rich by underselling everyone else in bulk, while the competition was left with no customers at all. Competing was allowed, wiping out the shop next door was not. Once a year, in June, something strange took over the streets of York. It wasn't a market, it wasn't a fair, it wasn't any ordinary working day hauling carts of meat through town. It was the feast of Corpus Christi, and the entire city turned into an open-air stage, with dozens of scenes performed at once on wooden wagons that rolled through town, stopping at stations marked by banners, while the crowd moved from stop to stop watching the story unfold in order. These performances became known as mystery plays, and before you picture something like a detective story, the word here has nothing to do with suspense. These were biblical scenes, performed live by amateur actors, for a crowd that moved from one point of the city to another to follow different chapters of the sacred narrative, from creation all the way to the Last Judgment. The fascinating detail is who produced each scene, the city's guilds, and not at random. There was a deliberate effort to match each guild to the story it performed. The shipwrights got Noah's Ark, obvious enough. The goldsmiths got the arrival of the three kings, since they handled precious metals every single day. And here's where the popular version of the story usually gets it wrong. The crucifixion scene itself, the exact moment of hammer striking nail, didn't belong to the butchers. It belonged to the pinners, the craftsmen who made iron nails, a trade connection so direct it practically writes itself. What belonged to the butchers was a different scene, nearly as heavy. The death of Christ, the scene right after, the moment the body already hanging on the cross is declared dead and begins being prepared for burial. Men used to handling carcasses, used to dead weight, used to the physical process of preparing a body, were put in charge of acting that out in front of the entire city. It's a small distinction, but it completely changes how you read the whole episode. The city didn't hand the butchers the hammer blow. It handed them what came after: the handling of the body, the weight, the stillness that follows violence, all of it, something a man who works with meat every day understands in a way no other trade in the city could quite match. It's quite the contrast. Covered in real blood all week, in a job much of society looked down on as dirty. And once a year, at the center of the most important event on the city's calendar, trusted with one of the most quiet, most sacred moments in the entire Christian story. That tradition survived, with interruptions, for more than 200 years, until it was suspended in the 16th century amid the religious tensions of the time. And the beautiful part is that it never fully disappeared. The city of York still revives parts of that cycle today, with rebuilt wagons and modern guilds stepping into roles that trace back more than 600 years. And speaking of surviving, the formal organization of London's butchers, the very same one that grew out of informal gatherings back around the year 975 and earned official recognition in 1272, still exists. Formally chartered centuries later as a livery company, it remains among the oldest guilds in the city today. A direct, unbroken line between the man in the pillory and any butcher working in London right now. It was for that same man, watched closely, punished when he failed, but also trusted with the quietest role in an entire sacred performance, that a recipe like this beef stew with wine and saffron sauce was written down centuries ago, a practical dish, within reach of anyone with some purchasing power, and a reminder that behind every medieval meal sat an entire system of rules, punishment, and faith that today feels almost like fiction. At the end of the day, the medieval butcher was far more than the filthy, dishonest villain popular imagination loves to draw. He was a professional closely watched by strict laws, publicly punished when he failed, and absolutely essential to the health of an entire city in an age with no safety net of modern medicine. Selling bad meat wasn't just unethical, it was genuinely dangerous, and the society of the time understood that far better than most modern stereotypes give it credit for. And maybe that's the biggest contrast in this whole story. Narrow streets born out of tax evasion that ended up protecting people's food. Confusing laws, hiding a real logic of consumer protection. And ordinary men, covered in blood all week, trusted once a year with the quietest, most human role in an entire sacred performance. Next time you walk past a butcher shop, or even that candle store in the York shambles, it's worth remembering all of this. And if you made it this far, you already know what to do. Drop a like, tell me where you're watching from, and subscribe for the next trip back in time. See you at the next recipe.